What happens when an automaker decides to build a vehicle that nobody asked for? You don't get another SUV, another sedan, or another sports car. Sometimes, you get something like the Chevrolet SSR. It looked like a hot rod from the 1950s, had the proportions of a pickup truck, the roof mechanism of a convertible, and eventually received a V8 powerful enough to make the whole thing genuinely quick. And the strangest part is that Chevrolet actually put it into production. The SSR wasn't created because Chevrolet had discovered a massive market waiting for a retro-styled roadster pickup. Quite the opposite. It was an experiment in how far nostalgia, design, and engineering could take a vehicle that didn't fit into any traditional category. To understand why the SSR existed, we have to go back to the late 1990s, when the American automotive industry was rediscovering its past. Retro design was becoming increasingly popular. Cars like the Volkswagen New Beetle and Plymouth Prowler demonstrated that customers were willing to buy vehicles whose designs deliberately looked backward while their engineering looked forward. General Motors wanted a piece of that movement. Chevrolet had decades of iconic pickup trucks behind its name, and the company began exploring an idea that sounded strange even inside GM. What if a classic American pickup were transformed into a modern two-seat roadster? The concept appeared at the 2000 Detroit Auto Show as the Supersport Roadster, or SSR. The reaction was far stronger than Chevrolet expected. The vehicle looked like something from an alternate version of American automotive history, a low, wide pickup with enormous rounded fenders, a tall hood, a short cabin, and a tiny cargo bed behind it. But the most impressive feature was hidden above the seats. Instead of using a traditional soft top, Chevrolet envisioned a retractable hardtop that could disappear electrically behind the cabin. It gave the SSR something almost no other production vehicle had: the ability to transform from a closed sports car into an open roadster while still keeping the basic shape of a pickup. GM executives saw enough potential to approve production. But turning the concept into a real automobile was far more complicated than simply putting a body on a chassis. The SSR needed to retain the dramatic proportions of the show car while satisfying crash regulations, manufacturing requirements, and everyday usability. The result was built on GM's GMT 360 platform architecture, related to the Chevrolet Trailblazer family, but heavily modified for the SSR's unique body and rear-wheel drive layout. And then came the roof. The retractable hardtop became one of the vehicle's defining engineering features. It wasn't a simple soft fabric roof that folded into the trunk. The SSR used a complex power-operated metal roof that had to move through a carefully choreographed sequence before disappearing behind the cabin. That mechanism looked spectacular when it worked, but it also added weight, complexity, and cost to an already unusual vehicle. The designers were chasing an experience rather than maximum efficiency. The SSR wasn't supposed to be the lightest pickup. It wasn't supposed to be the cheapest convertible. It wasn't even supposed to be the fastest sports car. It was supposed to make people stop and look. And it succeeded. When the production SSR arrived for the 2003 model year, it looked almost exactly like the concept that had caused such a sensation in Detroit. That alone was remarkable. Usually, concept cars become significantly less dramatic once engineers and accountants get involved. The SSR somehow retained its exaggerated fenders, chopped roof proportions, huge grille, rounded headlights, and unmistakable retro personality. But underneath that wild exterior was a vehicle that had to answer a much more difficult question: would people actually pay real money for something this strange? Chevrolet believed they would. The company positioned the SSR as a premium lifestyle vehicle, combining the emotional appeal of a classic hot rod with the usefulness of a pickup and the freedom of a convertible. But there was a problem hiding underneath the surface. The SSR was heavy. Very heavy. And initially, its performance didn't quite match the aggressive appearance. The first versions used a 5.3-liter V8 producing around 300 horsepower, paired with a 4-speed automatic transmission. It wasn't slow, but it didn't feel like the wild American hot rod its appearance promised. Chevrolet would eventually solve that problem with a much more powerful engine and a manual transmission. But by then, another problem had already appeared. The SSR wasn't simply unusual. It was expensive. And Chevrolet was about to discover that being unique doesn't necessarily mean being desirable enough to sustain a business case. The Chevrolet SSR had already accomplished something most production cars never managed to do: it looked almost exactly like the concept that inspired it. But turning that visual fantasy into a successful business was proving much harder. The problem was that Chevrolet had created a vehicle caught between several worlds without completely belonging to any of them. It was too expensive to be a normal pickup, too heavy to be a serious sports car, too impractical to replace a traditional convertible, and far too unusual to appeal to mainstream truck buyers. Yet Chevrolet continued pushing forward. The company believed the SSR could become an emotional purchase, a vehicle people bought not because they needed it, but because they simply wanted something completely different. And there was no denying that the design had presence. Park an SSR next to almost any other vehicle from the early 2000s and it looked like it had arrived from another universe. The enormous rounded fenders, chopped windshield, exposed-looking grille, high beltline, and tiny pickup bed gave it the appearance of a custom-built hot rod that had somehow escaped from a car show and ended up at a Chevrolet dealership. But the first SSR had a serious problem. The mechanical hardware underneath couldn't quite live up to the attitude of the design. The original 5.3-liter V8 produced around 300 horsepower, but the SSR weighed well over 2 tons. That meant the truck looked dramatically faster than it actually was. Chevrolet knew enthusiasts were going to notice. So the company went back to the drawing board. For 2005, the SSR received the 6.0-liter LS2 V8, the same basic engine family that powered the Chevrolet Corvette of the era. Output jumped to 390 horsepower, and suddenly the strange retro pickup had the muscle to match its appearance. Even more importantly, Chevrolet finally offered a 6-speed manual transmission. This changed the character of the SSR completely. The vehicle was still heavy, still unusual, and still not remotely practical compared with an ordinary pickup, but now it had genuine performance credentials. The LS2 gave it serious acceleration, while the manual transmission allowed drivers to actually interact with the engine instead of simply waiting for an automatic gearbox to make decisions. The SSR had finally become the hot rod Chevrolet originally promised. And yet the engineering story was even more complicated than the engine. Almost everything about the SSR required special solutions. Its body was made from steel rather than lightweight aluminum, partly because Chevrolet needed the rigidity and manufacturing strength required for a vehicle with such a complex structure. The retractable roof demanded significant engineering effort and packaging space. The enormous body panels were difficult to manufacture compared with conventional pickup shapes. The vehicle's unusual proportions required specialized production methods. And because the SSR was built in relatively small numbers, Chevrolet couldn't spread those costs across millions of vehicles. Every SSR represented a much larger investment than an ordinary Chevrolet truck. That mattered because the final price was far removed from what customers expected when they saw a Chevrolet badge. Depending on configuration and model year, the SSR occupied a price range that brought it into competition with much more established performance and luxury vehicles. And that created a psychological problem. People could walk into a Chevrolet dealership, look at the SSR, and then look at sports cars, luxury cars, or much more capable trucks costing similar money. The SSR had to convince buyers that being unique was worth the premium. Sometimes it succeeded. But not often enough. Chevrolet also had another problem. The SSR wasn't particularly useful as a pickup. The cargo bed was tiny compared with a normal truck, and the vehicle's low stance and two-seat configuration made it more of a lifestyle toy than a working vehicle. That wasn't necessarily a flaw. The entire point was to create something different, but it meant Chevrolet couldn't rely on the enormous traditional pickup market that had made trucks so profitable for GM. The SSR needed its own customers. And those customers were difficult to find. Still, the vehicle began developing a small but passionate following. Owners loved the combination of old-school American styling and modern V8 performance. The retractable hardtop remained one of the most spectacular features, transforming the SSR from a closed hot rod into an open-air cruiser at the press of a button. The LS2 versions could sound genuinely aggressive, and the rear-wheel drive layout gave the truck the kind of character enthusiasts expected from an American performance machine. But there was an uncomfortable reality behind all of this. Chevrolet had created a vehicle that people could admire much more easily than they could justify buying. It was a conversation starter. It was a head-turner. It was memorable. But being memorable isn't the same thing as being commercially successful. And the SSR's sales numbers began revealing the problem. Chevrolet had originally expected the vehicle to become a recognizable lifestyle product, but demand never reached the levels necessary to justify the complexity of producing it. The company had invested heavily in a vehicle occupying a tiny niche, and the niche simply wasn't large enough. By the middle of the 2000s, the automotive industry was changing rapidly, consumer preferences were shifting, and GM was facing serious financial pressure. The SSR was becoming increasingly difficult to justify. And then came the decision that would turn this strange experiment into a piece of automotive history. Chevrolet would end production. The last SSR rolled off the line in 2006, bringing the experiment to an end after only a few years. Chevrolet had tried to create a pickup, a roadster, a hot rod, and a retro icon all at once. The market had answered with a simple message: people loved looking at it more than they loved buying it. But that wasn't necessarily the end of the story. Because years after Chevrolet abandoned the SSR, something interesting began happening. The same qualities that had made the vehicle difficult to sell when it was new, its rarity, strange design, complicated roof, powerful V8, and complete lack of resemblance to anything else, started making it desirable to collectors. The SSR had failed to become a mainstream success. But perhaps it had succeeded at something much more difficult: becoming unforgettable. When Chevrolet ended SSR production in 2006, it would have been easy to write the entire project off as another strange experiment that had failed to find its audience. From a purely commercial perspective, that conclusion would have been understandable. The SSR had never become a volume seller, and GM had spent enormous resources developing and producing a vehicle aimed at an extremely narrow market. But history has a strange way of treating cars differently from accountants. Some automobiles become successful because millions of people buy them. Others become memorable because almost nobody did. The Chevrolet SSR belongs firmly in the second category. In total, fewer than 25,000 SSRs were produced during its production run, making it a relatively rare sight even compared with other low-volume American performance cars of the era. And as the years passed, its biggest weakness slowly became one of its greatest strengths. The SSR was different. Completely different. You could put an SSR beside a Corvette, a Mustang, a Silverado, or a Porsche and immediately understand that it belonged to none of them. It was a pickup, but not really a pickup. It was a convertible, but not really a convertible. It was a hot rod, but it was built with modern manufacturing and technology. And that combination is precisely why the SSR has survived in people's memories. Think about what Chevrolet was attempting. The company wasn't simply resurrecting an old design. It was trying to recreate an entire emotional era of American automotive culture, the period when hot rods, custom pickups, chrome, V8 engines, and dramatic proportions defined the American car scene. But instead of using a traditional soft top, Chevrolet gave the SSR a complex retractable hardtop. Instead of an old-school V8 with carburetors, it eventually received the modern LS2. Instead of a simple ladder frame work truck, it used a sophisticated platform adapted specifically for its unusual mission. It was nostalgia built with 21st-century engineering. And perhaps the most ironic part is that the SSR may have been too early. Today, manufacturers regularly build vehicles that mix categories together. Coupes become SUVs. SUVs become performance cars. Pickup trucks receive supercharged V8s and track-focused suspension. Electric crossovers accelerate like supercars. The boundaries between vehicle categories have almost disappeared. In the early 2000s, however, the SSR was doing something that the industry had not yet become comfortable with. Chevrolet was essentially saying, you don't need a logical reason to own a car. Sometimes you just want something ridiculous. The problem was that the SSR arrived during a difficult period for General Motors. The company was carrying enormous structural costs, competition was becoming increasingly intense, and consumer priorities were changing. A niche vehicle with expensive engineering and limited production potential was always going to be vulnerable. The SSR couldn't generate the kind of sales numbers that a conventional truck or SUV could. And unlike a Corvette, it didn't have decades of established performance heritage to justify its premium. It had to create its own identity from scratch. In the end, it didn't quite manage to do that while it was new. But once production ended, the story began changing. Enthusiasts started appreciating the SSR for exactly what it was instead of judging it for what it wasn't. It didn't need to be the ultimate pickup. It didn't need to be the ultimate sports car. It didn't need to be practical. Its purpose was simply to be unlike anything else. And in that sense, Chevrolet succeeded completely. The SSR also deserves credit for something else. It proved that Chevrolet was willing to take genuine risks with its product lineup. The early 2000s were filled with cautious designs and vehicles created to fit carefully defined market segments. The SSR ignored that approach. It was expensive, complicated, visually extreme, and almost impossible to classify. From a business perspective, those qualities were dangerous. From a historical perspective, they are exactly what make the vehicle interesting. And that is why today the SSR is increasingly viewed not simply as a failed Chevrolet, but as one of the most unusual American production cars of its generation. The 6.0-liter LS2 versions are especially interesting because they combine the SSR's bizarre retro personality with a genuine modern performance engine. Add the 6-speed manual transmission, rear-wheel drive, retractable hardtop, and tiny cargo bed, and you end up with a vehicle that could probably never be approved by an automaker today in exactly the same form. There would simply be too many questions. Who is it for? How many will we sell? Why does it need to exist? And that may be the real reason the SSR feels so special now. It came from an era when manufacturers were still willing to ask those questions and sometimes ignore the obvious answer. Chevrolet didn't need to build the SSR. The company chose to build it because someone inside GM believed there was value in creating something that made people smile. It didn't become a commercial triumph. It didn't revolutionize the pickup market. It didn't become the next Corvette. But it became something else, a snapshot of an automotive industry willing to experiment with nostalgia, performance, and completely irrational ideas. And perhaps that's why the SSR deserves more respect today than it received when it was new. Because automotive history isn't only about the winners. Sometimes the most interesting stories belong to the machines that tried something nobody else was brave enough to attempt. The Chevrolet SSR was too strange for the pickup market, too impractical for truck buyers, too expensive for mainstream customers, and too unconventional to become a traditional sports car. Yet precisely because it failed to fit anywhere, it created a place of its own. A place where a retro hot rod could have a pickup bed, a modern V8, a retractable metal roof, and absolutely no logical explanation for why it needed to exist. And maybe that's the perfect ending for the SSR. Chevrolet tried to build the pickup that nobody asked for, the market said no. History said yes, because decades from now, nobody will remember every ordinary truck Chevrolet sold in the early 2000s. But they will remember the strange red or black machine with enormous fenders, a folding metal roof, a tiny bed, and a V8 under the hood, and they'll still ask the same question: why did Chevrolet build this thing? And that's exactly why the SSR will never be forgotten.